Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah, and I am so happy to be with you again on a Tuesday for yet another author interview. I'm very excited to bring you this one. This author interview is with Kari Bovée, who is the author of, among other novels, Grace and the Wings. This is the first in a new series that she's writing called the Grace Michelle Mystery Series. And it is, if you're a regular listener to the podcast, then you know that I really like historical fiction. And this one's set in 1920 in New York, so a very fun time period. It reminded me a little bit of Murder Knocks Twice that I spoke with Susanna Calkins of, I don't know, I want to say a couple weeks ago, could have been a couple months ago for all I have a sense of time anymore. But that one was set in 1929 in Chicago, so I don't know. It's, as my dad used to say, it's exactly the same, only different. It's not the same, but it's a little bit that same time period. You get the, it was just an interesting time for women. From something as frivolous as fashion, when, women started bobbing their hair, which was actually a big thing, to wearing, they went from wearing like ankle-length dresses, some to above the knee dresses sometimes. I mean, it was this very fascinating time period. And then as the 20s progressed and we get to 1929 and then the Depression in the 30s and all, I don't know, it's fascinating to me. So I'm going to stop babbling because you can probably Wikipedia it and find out more about the 20s. But this book, Grace and the Wings, let me give you the description. New York City, 1920. Grace Michelle has everything she wants. A home, a family, and a future career as a costume designer for the famed showman Florence Ziegfeld Jr.'s Ziegfeld Follies. Pretty good for a girl who once lived on the streets of New York City. But when her sister Sophia, the star of the show, is murdered, Grace's safe and protected life is shattered. War veteran Chet Riker has made it a practice to keep his distance from others. Love, after all, leads only to pain. But Chet has a problem. A big one. He's become indebted to mob boss Joe Marciano in an attempt to save his estranged mother's life. Marciano wants him to pay up or else. So desperate to get the money, Chet contacts former client Florence Ziegfeld Jr. for work. Soon, Chet finds himself playing bodyguard for introverted Grace, who has reluctantly agreed to be Ziegfeld's new leading lady, on the condition that Ziegfeld promises to find Sophia's killer. Upon meeting Grace, Chet quickly finds his hardened theory that love equals pain tested. Grace, meanwhile, is swept up in a life she never wanted, both as the Follies star and as the pawn in a series of publicity stunts during a transcontinental train trip to California that puts her life at risk. Who would want her and Sophia dead? Together, she and Chet must confront publicity-hungry Ziegfeld, power-driven Marciano, and their own past to find Sophia's killer and let themselves love once again. How can you not think that's fascinating? I mean, I love detailed descriptions like that. So you get a really good idea of what this book is about. It is obviously a mystery. We knew that from the beginning, but historical fiction mysteries are fascinating to me because they're historical fiction and I love reading about certain, time periods, different time periods. This one is even more fascinating to me because in historical fiction, you often have run-ins with real people, with historical characters. In this one, there are several characters who are more than just cameos. Florence Ziegfeld Jr. is a pretty major character in this book. And so to take someone who is fairly well known. You can look him up and find pictures and read about his life, and have him be a fairly major character, I think is so interesting. And I wanted to ask Kari approximately 8 million questions about all the different actual historical figures who appear in the book, from George Gershwin to W.C. Fields, just on and on. I mean, there's so many, and I wanted to just sit down and ask her 8 billion questions, but that would have made for a 8 billion hour long podcast, and nobody has time for that. So this book is great. I loved the characters. I loved the setting. I loved the historical period. I loved learning about the follies, which I had heard of but never really delved into, talking to Kari about research, etc. So again, the book is Grace in the Wings. I do have copies to give away, so stay tuned until the end of the podcast to find out how you can win a copy of the first Grace Michelle mystery, Grace in the Wings by Kari Bovée. Let's go ahead and let Kari talk about her book, and I will stop gushing and babbling. Let's go ahead and turn to that interview.
Kari, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
I am very excited to have you here to talk about your new book, which is called Grace in the Wings. It's a Grace Michelle mystery. Before we get to the book, though, I would love to get to know you just a little bit, so if you could share whatever you would like to share about yourself.
Well, yeah, I guess I've been writing for a long, long time. I've been writing stories since I was, very young, like in the third grade, and have just really found the medium to be a great outlet, an emotional outlet, an intellectual outlet. I love reading, I love writing, and so it just seemed natural that one day I would write a novel, and I wrote my first novel in 1990, and that one is Under the Bed, Where It Shall Remain. But yeah, and so I've been writing for a long time. My other passion is horses, and I've had horses most of my life. I've competed with horses. I've done, practically every discipline with horses, and they're just a huge part of my life, and I can't imagine my life without them. So those are my two passions that have been kind of lifelong passions, and I've had other interests along the way, but those two are the ones that have kind of stuck.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow. What kind of horses do you have? I don't know a lot about horses, but
I have 4 horses. I have 2 of them are Arabian quarter horse crosses, and the other 2 are Arabian saddlebred crosses. And yes, the common denominator is Arabian. I have always loved Arabian horses. They're beautiful, for one thing, and they're smart and sensitive, and just they're great, great companions. And that's kind of been really my only exposure to my own horses. I would like to try a different breed at some point, but that's going to have to wait a while.
I know it's not the it's kind of an expensive hobby from what I've heard.
It's an expensive hobby, yes, and especially when you get into the showing. I haven't done any showing for about 4 years now because I've sort of been focusing on the writing career, and so I haven't really been in the show ring much. And it's helped financially, but still there's the care and feeding, and I always find things to do with my horses that seem to cost money. I just bought a very expensive saddle. It's just kind of like it never ends.
Yes, I'm sure. But let's go ahead and now switch our attention to the book. It is called, as I said, Grace in the Wings. Can you give me a quick overview of the book?
Yeah, it takes place in 1920. It takes place on Broadway, the Ziegfeld Follies, and my protagonist is a costume designer. She's very shy, very introverted, and the star of the show, her sister, Sophia Michelle, dies mysteriously, and in order to find the murderer, Grace has to step into onto the Broadway stage, and become a star in order to find the murder. So that is basically, in a nutshell, what it's about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and well, I'm going to get to that soon. But so, what was your initial inspiration for the story?
Well, I've always been really fascinated with show business, and I think it stemmed from, when I was a young girl, I loved watching those old movies, like the old black and white movies from the early 1930s, and one of the films that I saw was The Great Ziegfeld, and it was starring Myrna Loy and, who was it? Myrna Loy and William Powell. And Fanny Brice was in it and playing herself. And I was so impressed by the elaborateness of the sets and all the mechanical moving pieces. There were horses, there were feathers, there were, bubble machines and all these wonderful things. And then, of course, the costuming was incredible. And Ziegfeld was kind of known for his over-the-top costumes and sets. And so I had wanted to write, I started Grace in the Wings under a different title many years ago, and then I started it as a romance. I thought I wanted to write a romance, but I really wanted to write mystery. But, life got in the way, things started happening, so I put it aside for a while. And then actually one of the horse trainers that I had several years ago, she and I were sitting around one day, having a glass of wine, and she told me that her mother was a Ziegfeld girl. And
wow.
I was shocked. I couldn't believe it. I kind of didn't believe her. And so I started researching, and I didn't find anything on her mother, although I do believe her mother was one. But in the research of this woman, I started finding out all this amazing stuff about these Ziegfeld girls and how many actors and actresses got their start with him. Names that we see all the time got started with Florence Ziegfeld back in, I think he started in 1910, and he, did his shows till he died in 1936.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
I was fascinated by the how many people and what he did in his career.
So I am going to jump in here so we can take our first break of the podcast. When we come back, we'll be talking more about the historical characters who appear in the book. There will be a little bit more gushing on my part, but thankfully not as much as when it's just me talking, because I ask the questions and try to move on. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Still on the search of that one true love? On the limbo in this crazy world of dating, marriage, relationships? Well, listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Relationship Podcast, your one-stop podcast for everything about relationships.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am speaking today with author Kari Bovée about her new Grace Michelle mystery entitled Grace in the Wings. Let's go ahead and get back to that interview.
The book is peopled, if you will, with a ton of historical figures, which often happens with historical fiction. But I kept Googling people to see, like, is this a real person? Am I remembering this correctly? And to learn a little bit more about them. So it was really fun for me because I'm kind of a history nerd in that way. And so I got to learn all sorts of things about that period and about different actors and actresses.
That's one of the things that I love so much when people tell me that when they read my books, they're like, oh, I just had to go research this person and that person, because it's great to entertain, but it's also great to educate, and it's great to get people excited about the characters in your book.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Grace, who is the main character. What do you think about her character will resonate with your readers?
Well, she is a fictional character. I made her up, and I really wanted to explore the idea of a creative person. And I know a lot of creatives, and many of them are very introverted, and they're all about the work, and they're not really that much about, being around people and all of that. That's not really what turns them on. What they really want to do is immerse themselves in the work. And so I, made her this very shy and introverted, rather protected person, and put her into a situation that was kind of like, what's the worst thing that could happen to her? And just started exploring with that. And I think that a lot of people will relate to the feelings of, having a dream but not sure how to get to that dream, having that dream put on hold, having to sacrifice yourself for the sake of someone else, and kind of just that whole premise behind, just the art. And I think people will resonate with that, specifically creative people, but also people, everyone's creative really, but people who work in creative fields, I think will kind of appreciate that.
Yeah. And Grace, as you mentioned, is fictional, but as I also mentioned, there's a lot of actual people throughout this book. How was it writing? I mean, often when you're reading historical fiction, you get historical figures who just kind of make little cameos. Right. But you've got a historical figure as kind of a major part of the story with Flo Ziegfeld. So how was it writing a fictional story about real people? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. It's a little challenging because it's, you want to stick with the facts, but for the sake of the story, you kind of have to massage them a little bit, and it's always a little bit tricky because you don't want to falsely represent someone, but at the same time, do we really know what that person was all about? Do we really know what their fears were, what their hopes were, what they thought, how they felt about things? We know about them through what they said and, of course, what they did in history, but I'm kind of intrigued with kind of getting really behind what their motivations were and if they were actually very nice people or not very nice people. So that's something that I found challenging, but in a good way. And I would take, a character like Flo Ziegfeld, read quite a bit about him, and then so I inferred a lot of things. And it's not an exact representation of him, but it is close. I mean, I think it's believable, people can kind of get behind what I was trying to do here with him.
Yeah. And then the character of Sophia, Grace's sister, is married to Jack Pickford, who was a real person, sister of Mary Pickford, who was an actress, and he was actually married to someone who died suddenly, but it's not Sophia. So talk about that process of kind of, creating a new person.
Is Olive Thomas, right?
Yeah.
Yes, and she was the inspiration for Sophia. I read her story, and I was just like, wow, this is so cool. It was one of the very first publicized Hollywood scandals. And she was, this beautiful, beautiful girl, but wild beyond belief, and ended up dying mysteriously. She was married to Jack Pickford, and there was always, her death was sort of always this pall that hung over him because, some people thought that she committed suicide because he wouldn't stop cheating on her. Others thought that she might have ended her life because he gave her syphilis. And then others thought that perhaps she was murdered. She had just taken out a huge life insurance policy. And but, the coroner ruled the death accidental by poisoning. She ingested some mercury bichloride, which was found in a cleaning solution in this Paris hotel, but also he was taking tablets of mercury bichloride for his syphilis. So, there was never really any concrete evidence on how she died. And, of course, he was, part of the very famous Pickford family, and so it was just a big, huge scandal. And I thought it was really, really kind of entertaining and exciting, so I decided to base Sophia on Olive Thomas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I found that fascinating, and I kept getting bogged down in how would I do that and what would I include? Sometimes I think too much.
I get it. I do too.
What kind of? It sounds like you did a lot. What kind of research did you do for the book?
Well, I did. I found a wonderful book. It's like a huge coffee table book that has tons of information on all the Ziegfeld girls and the Follies and the shows. And I think there was either a foreword by Ziegfeld's daughter, his daughter with Billy Burke, or I think she might have even co-written it. And so I thought that was a very credible source. I've done a lot of research on the Internet. I picked up a book on Lillian Lorraine, who was a prominent figure in Ziegfeld's life. He, she was his mistress and ruined one of his marriages and almost ruined the other. But and so I read a book on her and just kind of poked around and found things. Libraries. That coffee table book, though, was my biggest. That was the biggest resource.
Yeah, and one of the things that I discovered in my Googling for people who are listening was that Billy Bryce, am I remembering that correctly?
Fanny Bryce.
His wife. Billy Burke.
Billy Burke, yeah.
Billy Burke is best known, and maybe I'm getting everything mixed up, but best known as playing Glinda in The Wizard of Oz.
Yes.
Yes, so she's actually, I think would be fairly well known to even people of this generation because that movie is still so popular.
Absolutely, and several of the actors in that movie, Ray Bolger, and I think there was another one, maybe Burt Williams, I'm not sure, they got their start with Florence Ziegfeld too. So, yeah,
okay.
So, like I said, these names that we are so familiar with, they got their start with him. And Billy Burke she started out on stage. She wasn't, a quote-unquote Ziegfeld girl. She was, a serious actress. And she got into motion pictures fairly early on in their relationship. But, yeah, it was a tumultuous relationship, but I think it was also a very good relationship.
Sorry to interrupt once again, but let's go ahead and take our second break of the podcast so we can come back and finish this interview with Kari Bovée about her new book, Grace in the Wings. Stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. Today I'm speaking with Kari Bovée about her new Grace Michelle mystery. It's called Grace in the Wings. Let's go ahead and get back to that interview.
whenever I think of the Ziegfeld Follies, I keep picturing the Moulin Rouge.
Yeah.
But can you give maybe a bit of a description of the Ziegfeld Follies so people listening have more of an idea? I mean, I know it was on Broadway, but it's kind of this over-the-top production.
Right, and I think it was based on the Follies Bergère. I don't know if I'm saying that right, in France. And so Ziegfeld spent some time in France. He was connected with a Parisian actress named Anna Held, and she was performing on stage in these over-the-top production type of things, and he was trying to make it as a showman, and he discovered a man by the name of Sandow, the great Sandow, and he was like a muscle man, and that's how he started. That's how he got his start, was kind of taking this guy around and having him perform these great feats of strength, and of course the women loved him. And so between that and his relationship with Anna Held, and also his father, his father had an acting and dance school, and so that's kind of where he got the bug for show business. And so he just dreamt up this incredible series of shows and reviews, and they just kept growing and growing and growing. And it was just one of those things that I don't think Broadway had seen before or since, because it was just so huge.
Yeah, it's fascinating to even picture. I mean, you've got the moving columns and things that you wouldn't even that would be more complicated to do in 1920 than they would be now, with all the moving parts on stage.
Right.
and
they had
everything.
Quite an elaborate system of pulleys and cranks and all kinds of things that they did to make that magic happen on the stage. And like I said, bubble machines and all these things that we wouldn't even have known they were invented then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He just had an extreme vision, a fantasy. It was a complete fantasy.
Yeah. On the cover of the book, it is listed as a Grace Michelle mystery. Do you plan on more mysteries with Grace?
I do, yes. I want to start working on the second book here in the next few months, and I know it's going to take place in Los Angeles, in the film industry that was just sort of getting going there. And she's gone on to become a costume designer for the films. So I think that's going to be really fun. I don't really know what's going to happen yet. I kind of have an idea of the setting and sort of what's going to happen, but I can't say because I don't know enough yet. But yes,
right.
I have a couple of Grace Michelle books planned, and we'll just see how it goes. I think I have two others planned, and then we'll just see where it takes me.
Right. See if she keeps talking to you and
right.
needing more books. Yeah. That's exciting. This is not your first novel. It's not your debut novel. Are there any of your other books that you would like to talk about?
Sure. I have another series that is the Annie Oakley Mystery Series, and I took the fictional historical figure of Annie Oakley and created a fictional character out of her, and she is solving crimes in the Wild West show. And the first book of that series is called Girl with a Gun, and it talks about it sort of centers around when she started with the show. She was 15 years old, and she won a shooting contest against Frank Butler, who was a traveling show on his own. But for the sake of my story, I put him in the Wild West show, and then they meet and fall in love, and she becomes this famous star. And then she has a Native American assistant who helps her and makes her costumes, and the assistant dies mysteriously, and so she sets out to solve that murder. And then I wrote a prequel novella to that book called Shoot Like a Girl, and that is just a 40,000 word novella, and it highlights a time in Annie Oakley's life that was particularly difficult for her. She was, her family was poor. Her father died when she was young, and so to help make ends meet, her mother sent her to the Darke County Infirmary, which was a poorhouse, but it also trained young women and young men to help other families so that they could make money for their own family. And so she learned to cook and sew and all that. And she was farmed out to a family who she never named in real life. She only referred to them as the Wolves. And they were not very kind to her, and she spent a horrendous year with them. And like I said, she never spoke about it. So I thought, wow, I could really play with that. And in my Annie Oakley series, Annie Oakley has a horse that she is very bonded with and is part of her act. And this story, Shoot Like a Girl, sort of entails how she came to meet Buck and how they became so bonded. And it also launched her on a path to fighting for truth and justice. So there's that. And then the second book in this series is called Peccadillo at the Palace, and that is when the Wild West show traveled to England in 1887 to partake in Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee celebrations, and they performed for the Queen. And in my story, when they're on the ship on the way over, they took, all of their whole show over, which was quite a monumental task. But anyways, in my story, one of the Queen's assistants who's been sent over to escort them, he dies mysteriously, and also Annie's husband, Frank Butler, falls mysteriously ill. And I bring in a lot of the Irish politics and the East Indian politics that were going on in England at that time as part of the whole murder mystery. And, and then I'm working on the third novel, which is called Folly at the Fair, and it's when Buffalo Bill's Wild West show goes to Chicago to the Columbian Exhibition in 1893, and they performed there for 4 or 5 months.
Fascinating. So I'm definitely noticing a bit of a theme in terms of female protagonists solving mysteries and showmanship in there.
Strong female protagonists. I have a blog that is called Empowered Women in History, and I really like writing about women who were sort of mavericks of their time and who were working in a man's world or a very difficult world, a world that was unconventional for women and, making their mark.
Yeah, I love that. So you said you've been writing forever, that, you wrote stories as a kid. How did you then get into writing fiction?
It started in college. I majored in English literature and with an emphasis in creative writing, and I managed to somehow get all of my coursework completed by my junior year, and so I was able to take independent studies, and I took 3 independent studies that I was able to create for myself, and one of them was a short story independent study, another was a playwriting independent study, and another was screenwriting. And so I got to be one-on-one with my professors in creating these courses and then, of course, doing the coursework. So that's kind of what got it started. And then I graduated from college and realized that, I couldn't make a living writing fiction. And so I worked as a technical writer for a Fortune 500 company, a research and development kind of IT company, and did that for a while. But then it was when I had my first child, my husband and I made the decision that I would stay home. And I was so glad I did it, but I was starved for intellectual outlet. And I thought, I'm gonna see if I can write a novel. So that's when it started.
Oh, nice. Thank you. And actually, you're the second person I've spoken to recently that started writing when their first child was young. So definitely definitely a process, that
Right.
I've encountered before. Do you have advice then for aspiring authors?
I do. I would say, first of all, write what you really, really want to write. People sometimes, especially when they're starting out, they're like, I want to write a book that's going to sell. And that's great. And we all need to kind of keep in mind what the marketplace has, going on. But if you're not invested in your own story, nobody else is going to be. So if you want to write historical fiction and you think that you should be writing, I don't know, contemporary romance, but your heart's not in it, it's going to reflect in the work. So I would say that, and then, it's a tough business. There's a lot of rejection and criticism, and you need to believe in yourself and believe in your craft and believe in your passion, and don't give up. It's really hard. There's been many, many times where I was just like, man, I am just wasting my time.
Mm-hmm.
But because it's a passion, it just doesn't go away. And so if I were on my deathbed and I hadn't pursued this, no matter what the outcome, I would be really unhappy. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. When you take time to read, do you have favorite authors or genres?
Yes, I read a lot of historical fiction and historical mystery because that's one of the reasons I wanted to write it, was because I love to read it, and I also like contemporary mystery and like more literary style of works. But my favorite, I think some of the inspirations that I've had have been an author named Reese Bowen. She writes historical mystery. She has a Molly Murphy series and then a Royal Spyness series. And I also enjoy a writer named Stephanie Barron. She also writes as Francine Matthews, and she writes both historical fiction, and she started years ago. She wrote a mystery series using Jane Austen as the amateur sleuth, and I loved those books. I thought that was so exciting. Yeah, and who else? I like Deanna Rayburn's books a lot, and she writes historical mystery and historical fiction. I'm a big Philippa Gregory fan. It's Philippa or Philippa Gregory. She writes all the Tudor novels, the Other Boleyn Girl, and the White Princess and the White Queen, and all of those books. And I really, really enjoy historical fiction.
Yeah, me too. And now I need to check out the Jane Austen mysteries, because it's got to be it's got to be better than Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, which yes, I did read. Do you have a website? What is the website address, and where can people find you on social media?
Okay, the website is karibovée.com. Pretty straightforward. KARI. B as in boy, O, V as in Victor, EE.com. And I'm on Instagram as Kari Bovée _writer, and then Facebook as Kari Bovée. I've got a profile and then an author page. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Twitter, although I don't use Twitter that often. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. And as we are coming to the end of my prepared questions, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would like to mention now about the book or your other novels, anything that we haven't covered?
Well, I would just say they're all for sale on Amazon, and the Annie Oakley books are also for sale on other platforms. And I love to do book clubs. It's one of my very favorite things to do. I've done them remotely and I've done them in person, and it's just so fun to connect with readers on such a personal level. I really do enjoy that, because the bottom line is I'm doing this because I want to connect. I really like to find like-minded people and, exchange ideas and things like that. So, yeah, I think that's probably all that I'd want to say.
All right. Well, thank you so much, and thank you especially for taking the time to talk to me today about your new book, Grace in the Wings, as well as your Annie Oakley series. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.
Thank you once again to Kari for joining me to talk about her books. I have a quick aside before we wrap things up. Her name is spelled, as you see in the title, Kari, which is how my sister's name is spelled, but her name is pronounced Kari. So whenever I look at the book and I see Kari, my brain automatically thinks Kari. So if I said Kari at any point in this interview, I do apologize. When I look at the name, that's just what my brain says. So Kari, if I pronounce your name incorrectly at any point during this interview, I do apologize. And my sister would very much understand getting the name mispronounced, because hers gets mispronounced Kari all the time. So at any rate, thank you once again to Kari for joining me. Thank you, as always, to you, my listeners, for joining me for these interviews. I hope you enjoy listening to them as much as I enjoy getting to do them. They are so much fun. I just love listening to authors and getting to know a little bit of their story and finding out just the various parts of their process and their craft as they write these books for us to enjoy. As I said at the beginning, I do have some giveaway copies, so if you would like to win a copy of Grace in the Wings, you just have to go to social media, GSMC Book Review, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and comment on this episode. Episode 183, Interview with Kari Bovée. And this week, since we have a historical fiction mystery, tell me your favorite or preferred historical time period for historical fiction. I'm nosy and I want to know. So just go to GSMC Book Review, Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, and comment on the post with this episode 183, Interview with Kari Bovée, and you will be entered to win a copy of Grace in the Wings. Thank you so much again for joining me for this episode of the GSMC Book Review podcast. Please join me again on Friday when I have another historical fiction mystery. It's been a fun week, and with some surprising similarities, and yet, again, exactly the same, only different. That is with author Bradley Harper for the second of his Margaret Harkness book, Margaret Harkness Mysteries. That is a series, and this one is called The Queen's Gambit. So join me for that discussion with Bradley Harper. In the meantime, I hope you are having a wonderful week. I hope you continue to have a wonderful week, and I hope, as always, that you find time to get yourself lost in a good book. Thanks.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.